Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Southern Delaware Alliance Racial Justice, the town hall meeting on housing and racism. I'm glad all of you are with us this evening. We have not done much in the past in looking very closely at uh, racism, structural racism within housing, which is one of the essential basic needs of every human being, and the impact of such racism on one's total life. But tonight, I hope we give you some understanding of what it means to have a continuation in segregated housing and issues that limit the opportunities for people of color to get decent housing, affordable housing, housing of their own choosing. I'm not going to say anything else because, as usual, Calvin Jackson, who produces our webinars, has produced a small video which will make our statement, followed by which Don Peterson will introduce our two fantastic and very knowledgeable panelists who will lead us in a discussion. Again, we will leave the last half hour for audience participation. If you have questions, put them in the question and answer section, and Calvin will take charge of making sure that your questions are answered. And with that, Calvin, can we see the documentary? And again, welcome everyone.
I don't know about you, but every month I look forward to Calvin's videos, starting out with some music and some pictures that tell the story of whatever it is we're talking about. It's just a huge, I think, addition to these town hall meetings. So thank you, Calvin. Good evening, and thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Don Peterson. I'm the chair of the Outreach Committee of the Alliance for Racial Justice. You know, since its beginning 5 years ago, the Alliance has sponsored monthly programs to talk about all sorts of aspects of racism in this country and its corrosive consequences. Well, tonight, as Charlotte said, for the first time, we're going to begin a conversation about racism in housing. We're going to take a look at the history of housing discrimination in its many and varied forms. We'll take a look at how that discrimination has shown up in Delaware and this continues to show up in Delaware, and how it affects the lives of Delawareans every day. To help us with this discussion, we have two very gifted and talented people uh, that I'm pleased to introduce to you. We'll start with Dominique Scott. Dominique is with Pathways to Success, an organization here in Sussex County with which many of us are familiar. Dominique serves as a Fair Housing Initiative program educator. She informs, educates, and empowers throughout Sussex County to raise community awareness regarding discrimination as it relates to fair housing. She also provides assistance to people who believe they may be victims of housing discrimination. Dominique is also the co-chair of the Sussex County Housing Group Advocacy Committee. This group brings together multiple organizations and individuals as an effective coalition that fosters fair, safe, and affordable housing and brings community based on power of people and place. Our other guest is Natalie Fountain. Natalie is the Education and Training Director for the State of Delaware Division of Human Relations. DHR is the state agency charged with investigating complaints and enforcing federal and state laws against discrimination in housing and in places of public accommodation. DHR is also the administrative support to the State Human Relations Commission, which has a statutory authority in enforcing fair housing and public accommodation laws and in promoting amicable relations among Delaware's diverse populations. That's quite a task. In her role with the, in her role with the agency, Natalie conducts fair housing presentations statewide for the general public, training related to specific fair housing and public accommodation case conciliations, and also participates in activities related to the Commission's mission. Natalie and Dominique, thank you both for being here. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
I have to tell you, over the last several weeks that we've been putting this program together, Dominique and Natalie have taught me so much more than I ever knew that I didn't know. And I'm very grateful for the time and the effort that they put into tonight's presentation.
Thanks, Don.
So before we get started, I just want to remind everyone, as Charlotte mentioned, we'll take questions at the end. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, if you have a question as we proceed over the evening, that you type your question in the Q&A box by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. And then we'll make sure we have plenty of time to get to your questions. So we're going to begin tonight's presentation by watching a video, and it's called Segregated by Design. This film is based on the book that many of you may have read called The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government Segregated America. It's by Richard Rothstein, and it just happens that he also narrates this video. And I think it's exciting for us to let you all know that in the 2021 book club, Alliance's book club, this book is included on the list for the upcoming season. We hope this video piques your interest and makes you want to take a look at the book. So with that, Calvin, can we watch the video?
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it. The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540-square-foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market. As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of 1 or 2 real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of the federal interstate highway system. in many cases state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles. In 1957, Bill and Daisy Myers were able to purchase a home in Levittown, Pennsylvania, the Levitt Company's second large development. When the mail carrier discovered that he was delivering mail to an African American family, he let everyone in the neighborhood know, and as many as 600 white demonstrators soon showed up in front of the Myers' house, pelting the family and their home with rocks. Law enforcement stood by as this happened. For 2 months, rocks were thrown, crosses were burned, the Ku Klux Klan symbol was painted on the wall next door. Some policemen stood with the mob, joking and encouraging its participants. One sergeant was actually demoted to patrolman because he objected to orders he had been given not to interfere with the rioters. In 1951, World War II veteran Harvey Clark, his wife Janetta, and 2 small children rented an apartment in all-white Cicero, a suburb of Chicago. When the Clarks refused to leave, a mob of 4,000 rioted, raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. Time magazine reported that the police officers present, quote, acted like ushers politely handling the overflow at a football stadium, unquote. The only people that the grand jury indicted were Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. Stories like this were commonplace, and state-sponsored violence was a means, along with many others, by which all levels of government maintained segregation. Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases. Consider children who come from families where they're economically stressed, or in poor health because they have no access to good health care, or because they live in polluted environments. When they do come to school, for example, they may suffer from asthma because of that pollution and are drowsy from being awake at night, wheezing. They cannot then typically achieve at levels of children who come to school well rested. When you concentrate children like that in single classrooms, it's impossible for teachers to develop the kind of outcomes that they can in middle-class children who come to school healthy, unstressed, and able to pay attention to schooling. What economists know is that African American children from low-income families who grow up in segregated neighborhoods are less likely as adults to move into the middle class than are African American children whose families have the same low incomes but who live in integrated neighborhoods. So segregation itself impedes intergenerational mobility and perpetuates, rigidifies the inequality that we experience. Another thing that social psychologists have discovered is that decision-making is hampered when you don't have diverse decision-making groups. These psychologists have done experiments where they put people together to solve problems in both diverse groups and in segregated groups. And the diverse groups are much better able to solve problems because they challenge assumptions much more than the segregated groups do. So segregation impedes our political and economic success. We have 3 provisions in the federal Constitution that prohibit the kinds of actions that federal, state, and local governments pursued to create residential segregation. One is the Fifth Amendment, which requires the federal government to treat all citizens fairly. Another is the 14th Amendment that requires state and local governments not only to treat citizens fairly, but to treat them equally. And then the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also requires that we banish the effects of slavery, which Congress long ago determined was any form of second-class citizenship. So in fact, the prohibition on African Americans to purchase homes in federally subsidized white communities or the segregation of public housing created a form of second-class citizenship, which was a violation of the 13th Amendment. We cannot reverse de jure segregation mainly with lawsuits. We must also build a national political consensus leading to legislation, a challenging but not impossible task. Our focus now should be to develop policies that promote an integrated society, understanding it will be impossible to fully untangle the web of unconstitutional inequality that we've woven. To begin, we should first contemplate what we have collectively done and, on behalf of our government, accept responsibility to fix it.
Thank you. That video is just jam-packed. That's the 3rd or 4th time I've watched it, and it could bear more watching. I think what we will try to do is when we post this town hall on our YouTube page, we'll try to put a comment in to let you know where to find this video so that you can take a look at it yourself later. Dominique and Natalie, that video is just so full of so much important information that certainly I've never heard of before. For the sake of our audience here today, can you give us what you think are the 2 or 3 main takeaways? We'll start with Dominique, and then we'll ask Natalie.
Sure. And I think I can back up, Don, what you were saying. There's a lot of things that are going on in that video. Very, very, very important, and kind of shows It kind of shows what things have changed, you know, through housing over time. But a couple of things that I kind of hit home, especially working for an organization like Pathways to Success. One of the reasons why we're into this organization is because we believe in order to have healthy kids and kids that are thriving at the education level, we need to have healthy communities. So with that being said, a couple of things that stood out to me that has a major effect on some of the kids that are in our communities. Redlining has a very, very big effect on some of our kids because of the lack of opportunity that are in those areas. All the, I think there was a scene where it showed the different maps of redlining. That red area on the, if you look at that on a key, it's named hazardous. Which means that there's not a lot of opportunity in those areas, and there's lack of resources in terms of maybe within the schools the textbooks are not up to date. Maybe at some of the grocery stores, the fresh produce is not so much fresh, and maybe there's not a lot of opportunities that banks are kind of helping out, and the interest rates are really high. So that's kind of some of the opportunities that works against some of the student bodies that we are working with, and some of the people that we are working with. It just doesn't give them a lot of opportunity. And what that then leads into, because we do have students that are 9th through 12th, it leads into some of the trauma that some of the kids experience when they do go to school. And we call it, it's called adverse childhood experiences. So through a lot of the different trauma that they are experiencing in their communities and at home, it then is hard for them to disconnect when they come to school. They carry that kind of like a book bag on their back, and it really stresses them out, and they're not able to learn clearly. So I think there was a scene in this documentary where it showed the differences of a kid that's going through trauma versus a kid that's not going through trauma. And I think also, another thing that's going on is the gentrification portion of it, where you know, black and brown communities were thriving. However, you have white communities coming in and kind of taking over that. And one thing that we experienced here, especially in Lewis, Delaware, was West 4th Street was recently named Martin Luther King Boulevard. And that was originally a very black and brown neighborhood. So that was something where the kind of the character of the urban environment was kind of taken over, where more Caucasians kind of moved in and more businesses kind of moved in. But the positive thing is that it was recently named Martin Luther King Boulevard. So
right, that neighborhood is very different now than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, for sure. Natalie, how about you? A couple takeaways from you from the video.
I think the key points for me are the government created the scenarios, that the government created what we have today, that left alone, people lived where they could live, where they wanted to live, where they could either find a place to live, and that as the country shifted from its rural roots, as folks moved from either they left the terror of the Deep South to migrate to these northern communities looking for safe spaces to live and raise their families and to work and earn a living, that as we saw the industrialization of the country and we saw the post-Civil War, Black Americans seeking to stand on their own 2 feet as citizens, full-fledged citizens of this country, this government took very proactive and intentional steps to restrict and limit access to America for Black Americans. And so when you look at the intentionality of these decisions, these were not impulsive thoughts. These were intentional acts that were government created, government mandated, and government instituted across multiple domains, whether we're talking about redlining or having the maps drawn up of these 250 cities throughout the country and designating undesirable areas that were areas for Black Americans and other people of minority backgrounds lived, and then refusing to finance those communities. That was intentional. When you talk about Levittown and how the government would not lend Bill Levitt money to build those communities, there was a housing shortage post World War II, as soldiers were coming back and the babies were starting to be born, and the cities were ill-equipped. They didn't have enough housing stock, and so people were living in Quonset huts post World War II. The government said, we need to build the suburbs, but we are not going to underwrite your financing if you sell to Blacks. That was intentional. And so the thing that I kind of look at is how race was created in this country anyway. Race is a function of social constructs. If you look like this, you are this. If you look like this, you are that. If you look like that, we're going to privilege you above people who look like that. And so that definition of race that was created at this country's founding based on really, a social construct, not a biological anything. And then the reinforcement of that construct by our racial definitions and labels, but then how those labels were used to perpetually disadvantage with active government participation. So that people, Black Americans, are poorer, sicker, more traumatized, as Dominique said. The trauma persists throughout life. If you have these adverse childhood effects as you're at birth, it is traveling with you throughout your life. You have to overcome, the being born brown and being born into a community that's underserved, that's being born in a community that doesn't have water, that you're only allowed to live next to the environmental brownfields and poison areas. And so when you look at the totality, and that was why I really appreciated this video for this topic, because the totality, the breadth, the depth, the width, the pervasive persistence, participation by our government in preferencing some people at the expense of others. And so because of that government creation, I think the government has an obligation to remedy that.
That's absolutely right. And I think that the issue of the intentionality is something that is just, again, something that has been hidden from us, or at least we haven't tried to find out the information. And it's past time that we did that. It reminds me of Michelle Alexander's book on the new Jim Crow. Again, the intentionality that was behind mass incarceration.
Absolutely.
Very, very similar in terms of government interventions.
Absolutely.
Leading to the continuation of racism.
Absolutely.
Let's, the video does such a good job of showing what both of you have just talked about in terms of systemic racism in housing, how it came about, and the implications nationwide. Let's talk a little bit closer to home. Let's talk about what's going on right here in Delaware. Natalie, I know that you cover really the whole state, and Dominique specializes in Sussex County. Natalie, can you talk to us a little bit about where we see this kind of housing segregation in Newcastle and Kent County, and some of the impacts that you're seeing in those areas?
So as went the country, so went Delaware. And so when we look at Delaware's counties and we look at how Delaware is, rural on the bottom, kind of more rural and historically very, rural and agrarian on this lower county, and then less, still more rural and agrarian in the middle, and then more industrial in the northern county. And so when we look at the housing segregation, discrimination, we're seeing more of it in Newcastle County because it was always the most populous community, and some of the practices that were created in Newcastle or followed in Newcastle may not have been followed throughout the state simply because of the nature of those counties. And so, you know, Newcastle County in particular, Wilmington in particular, as the state's largest city, is still highly segregated. You know, we can look at that racial dot map, which I shared with you all earlier, that shows in color how deeply segregated our city remains. And, you know, as Wilmington goes, so goes the state. As the largest state in the country, I mean, in the state, the largest city in the state, if you don't have a healthy Wilmington, you're not going to have a very healthy state. Now, the population is changing in Sussex. There's in migration, but you know, we still have those pockets of poverty that Dominique will mention down there. But up here, we have the same thing. So, you know, in Wilmington, the city of Wilmington, while Newcastle County has you know, I can actually speak to some data. There's a wealth divide. So white households in Wilmington make $60,000 a year. Black households make 30. You know, housing stock in Wilmington, which is where people were allowed to live, you know, our county remains as segregated 51 years after Delaware ratified the Federal Fair Housing Act. Delaware ratified, it was passed in 1968 federally. Delaware ratified it in 1969. So 51 years later, we're still as segregated as we were then. Can people move where they can afford? They can try to, but they're still going to encounter discrimination. They're still going to encounter second-class treatment. You know, so when you look at things like Fairfax, the Fairfax neighborhood, which is along Concord Pike in Newcastle County, the Fairfax neighborhood was built in the 50s, and it was built for white people. Black people were, allowed to stay in certain streets in Wilmington, Vandiver Avenue, Pine Street, Governor Prince Boulevard. Those areas were designated colored on the real estate maps prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act. But the practice of limiting access remained. And so the law was passed, but the practice remained to limit access to these blue areas on the racial dot map. And we see that today. You know, when we look at policing as a consequence of housing discrimination, we know that the policing occurs far more in our poorer Wilmington communities. You know, we know that schools that serve our poorer Black Wilmington communities they're dealing with children who come from high need, high poverty communities. We saw just recently a case settled by the Department of Education addressing disparities in funding for children coming from high need communities. This didn't just happen out of the blue. These are consequences of decades and decades of omission, commission, and just inertia and willful disregard for what was happening with 20% of this state's residents. You know, so, you know, when you have your housing is near the Allied Kid plant along the river, and you have to go live down there, you're downstream from where these buildings are rotting, but historically they were chemical laden. And so, you know, what we see is high poverty rates in Wilmington. We see high rates of crime and violence. We see that along the I-95 corridor, those of you who take I-95 to go up to Philadelphia, those were communities that were on either side, or you see houses and streets and homes on either side. Well, where 95 sits were houses and streets and homes. And there was an intentional decision to run I-95 through those houses because those houses were lower income and predominantly Black, and they destroyed the community cohesion that existed, and that happened all over the country. Anything that happened there, we see in a smaller scale happening here. And so the poverty, the low infrastructure, we see that there's limited, the job growth is not occurring here, it's in the suburbs, but our transportation system does not exist robustly enough to get people to their jobs. So there's a spatial mismatch. So, you know, we don't have a healthy city, and our county is not as healthy as it could be because everybody's not participating in the same way that they could. We have poor neighborhoods with high rates of crime and violence, low school performance, low economic opportunities, poor food sources. We have a food desert. We have one grocery store that was built recently to serve the community within, I guess, the last 8 or 10 years. And there was a push to get a bus stop at that ShopRite so that people in the city could take the bus back and forth to get fresh foods and groceries. Otherwise, they'd have to go to the corner stores, like Dominique said, where there is no fresh produce, which then you have malnourished children, poorly nourished mothers who are carrying babies who are born low birth weight. So we see here the same kinds of things that we saw in the video persisting over time.
Thank you. We certainly, here in Sussex County, we are painfully aware of our sort of southern state status. You mentioned earlier something about one of the towns up in Newcastle that was a sundown town.
Yeah, Edgemoor was a sundown community. Yeah, it was a neighborhood of houses that were built during World War II for the shipbuilders. World War I and World War II, we had a shipbuilding industry here along the river, and the Edgemoor community was built. And in some of their history, you can see that there was a deed, and these are covenants that exist today, deed covenants, and you can't petition if you own a property that has a restrictive covenant attached to your property. You can't petition to have that removed. And I have information on that. But you don't see it very often. It's kind of hard to find, but it was a sundown community. Yeah. And you could not be in that Edgemoor after 8 o'clock at night.
Interesting, very interesting. Dominique, you see Sussex County, you're from originally Sussex County, aren't you?
I moved here. I'm originally from Baltimore, but I moved here when I was 5. So yes.
That's right. Yeah. I remember that now. So you have lots of experience here, and you're still working here in Sussex County. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that stand out for you that are obvious that there's housing racism here in Sussex County?
Absolutely. I think. Also, backing up of what Natalie said, there's a lot of effects that she's talking about that's occurring in Newcastle County. It's also occurring in Sussex. However, if someone's not from Sussex, they might think that Sussex County is strictly beach. And actually, there are 24 pockets of poverty in Sussex County, and that's including some of the beach areas. There's West Rehoboth, there are some of the areas in the east. There's West Rehoboth, there's Pinetown, there's Cool Spring, but due to a lot of the market being so high on the east, a lot of Black and brown people move to the west, and then that causes a lot of transportation issues of trying to get transportation to the east, where jobs are. There's jobs also in the west, but a lot of jobs are on the east, and the inconsistency of the transportation is a trickle-down effect for a lot of families, and that really affects a lot of families overall. So a lot of those effects that Natalie was talking about, the underfunded school and just not having the same opportunity, kind of the unsafe neighborhoods, some of those areas are really affecting people. And I know some of the things that hit close to home is a neighborhood that in 2019, finally they got water, and which is Ellendale, which I'm speaking about. And at that time, before, and they fought for years and years and years before that, 95% of their residents did not have water that they could use. So that affects, think about how many times that you use water a day for everything. It really it was affecting them. And they were going to their local childcare facility to use their well. And I mean, how many residents that they have in Ellendale, obviously everybody can't be using that same thing. So that was a big plus. also some of the effects of the industrial that Natalie was also talking about when DuPont was down here. When DuPont was down here in Seaford, a lot of people were affected by it, which then led to cancer due to some of the population, excuse me, some of the pollution that DuPont was giving out. So those were a lot of different things that was getting affected because of the lack of kind of the bacteria that was in the water that you couldn't use, and then in the pollution. Those were a lot of different things. And for some of the kids that we work with at Pathways to Success, transportation is a big issue, especially with students that go to Seaford. If you live within 1 to 2 miles outside of the school, you do have to walk, and there's a lot of different conditions and weather conditions. We're experiencing random heat wave right now in November, but there's a lot of different conditions that affect kids from not allowing them to come to school. And if there's not a lot of kids at a certain bus stop, then that bus stop is not seen by our public transportation system as something that's needed. So these are a lot of effects, and a lot of the kids are coming through communities and they're walking through some of these drug infested communities. And a lot of times they're getting sucked in. Rather make fast money, or come here with me. My uncles or cousins are doing this thing, or rather going to school. So a lot of our times our kids are stopped before they even get to school. It's becoming a huge problem. So those are a lot of things that we are working with some of the communities, some of the other communities. Lucas Development is in Milton, Diamond Acres, Mount Joy, Coverdale, Green Top. There are a lot of different communities like that. There is also a community off of Old State Road, which is right down from where the Southern Grill used to be. They call it the Hole, and it's one way in and one way out. And this is when I went in there, I actually had a flashback. I lived in South Africa for 2 years, and one of the flashbacks that I had was there was electricity pole, and everybody's electricity was connected to this one pole. And if something does happen to that pole, it affects everybody. And kind of going into that community, there's kids that are doing kid things, but there's a lot of the infrastructure of the houses is not the best health-wise for the community at all. And that's a lot of things. It's really hard for, going back to the trauma, it's really hard for kids to kind of see that and try to figure out a way to kind of bust out of that environment. So those are kind of some of the effects that are happening. There are loads of effects that are happening in Sussex County, but the major difference is from the east to the west of Sussex County. It's a whole different world. It really is a whole different world. And a lot of the big housing contractors that are here are not stepping foot into the western side. So there's not a lot of housing opportunities there. And there's not enough housing in general on both sides that are considered affordable. And affordable housing and low income housing are two different things. But affordable housing is considered someone that is paying at or below 30% of their gross income. You're not supposed to be going over that. Well, more than half of the community in Delaware is going over that. So there's not a lot of those opportunities. So inclusionary zoning is something that we're pushing for, of just giving more opportunities to people to kind of live in those communities, and just giving that hope that you need. Because like I said in the beginning, you need to have a good community infrastructure in order for you to thrive in other aspects of your life.
Yeah, one of the things that I've observed in Sussex County since I've been here is the very fact that we have these pockets of segregation throughout the county has made it easy for the rest of the county to basically ignore the situation. And I think that's part of the reason why we have so much why the conditions are so bad in some of those areas. It's just been historically easy to ignore them. Natalie, you look like you had a point you wanted.
Yeah, I wanted to just circle back around and get on something Dominique was saying, was that when you talk about the, healthy communities, if you're segregated and you're living in dilapidated housing stock, then you're looking at things like lead paint and how lead paint can cause developmental delays that mimic, mental retardation and developmental delays, and then that pushes kids into special ed, so to speak, or special education, which is a higher need, which is lower funding, and then you've got your educational outcomes are depressed, and then your access to social capital. And so the idea of I'm living next to a dentist, I'm living around the corner from a doctor, I'm living across the street from an attorney, I'm living around the corner from a college professor. Oh, up the street is Miss Smith, and she's a nurse. And so you have access to social capital networks that kind of help you either move into an educational opportunity or move into an employment opportunity. And when you are living in poor segregated communities, you don't have that access either. And so, you start out with every single, lead paint poisoning, poor educational outcomes, substandard housing that has old pipes, old windows, old heat, and so, those kinds of conditions that are existing in those pockets of poverty are exactly what's going on here in, Wilmington in particular, because the housing stock is older and the segregation is so intense in Wilmington that this city is not as healthy as it could be, simply because of the same kinds of situations.
Right. Exactly. It's hard to imagine any aspect of a person's life that isn't impacted by where they live.
Exactly.
And the living conditions which they live in.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a couple things. This is for the audience. I'm seeing a couple things going on. Please put your questions in the Q&A block, and we will get to them at the end of this. We won't be taking questions during the presentation. We'll be taking questions afterwards. And putting things into the chat, I'm afraid only the panelists are seeing the chat information. So just to be aware of that. The thing that you two have in common, besides your passion for the housing issues that we've been talking about, is that you're both involved with the Fair Housing Act, which we saw in the video was passed back in 1968. I would like to take just a few minutes to talk a little bit about the Fair Housing Act and how it is operating. I'm going to ask Dominique, can you give us just sort of the major provisions of the Fair Housing Act, and what do you see as some of its shortcomings?
Yeah, so just to, if I could just give an overview of the Fair Housing Act first, and then I can go into some of the provisions. The Fair Housing Act, basically what it is, it's illegal to discriminate against someone in the middle of a sale or in a rental based off of their protected classes. So I'm going to speak about, there are 7 protected classes federally. And we work closely with Delaware Human Relations, where Natalie is from, and they also hit on to the Delaware protected classes. There's 6 other Delaware protected classes. So she's going to kind of speak on behalf. We're going to kind of tag team this, if that's okay. So the protected classes that I'm going to speak on, one of the first protected class is race, and that is kind of the title of this presentation. So race is something that is occurring, and I think it's one of the hot words that is going on in our 2020 world that we're living in right now. But race is not being able to discriminate somebody based off of their physical traits or their genetic traits, based off of their different races. So white, African American, Native American, Native Hawaiian. There's 5 different races that HUD does identify. So you can't be discriminated against if you fall into this protected class. The next one is color, and color is based off of someone's complexion. So someone can be considered African American, but they can be different shades of that. So a lot of discrimination that you sometimes might see is a landlord or a slumlord, let's say, or a property manager might be discriminatory. Someone, maybe they want only dark-skinned people to live there, or light-skinned people to live there. So that is a form of identification. The next one is religion. You can't be discriminatory when it comes to your religious belief. You're free to believe in whatever you believe in. So you can't be discriminatory against that. An example would be not allowing someone that maybe has a Jewish background, saying that only Jewish people are able to live in this apartment complex. You can believe in whatever you believe in, but it should have equal access to everybody. So that is another one where people can be discriminated against. National origin is something that affects a lot of Delawareans, because we do have a lot of people that are coming from a lot of different countries, especially in Sussex County. We have a lot of people coming from Haiti, and we have a lot of people coming from Central America and South America. So a lot of people are discriminated against based off of their nationality. And a lot of times it might not be a discriminatory, a face-to-face situation. It can be discriminatory over the phone, because people that are coming from different countries, they might have an accent. And maybe the person on the other end is discriminatory, because as soon as they hear the accent, that there is not any vacancies anymore. So that is kind of a form of discrimination when it comes to that. And it can be based off of accent too, as well. Gender discrimination or sex discrimination is something else that occurs. And within that category, there is a little bit of more breakdown of that category. There's sexual harassment within the category of quid pro quo, where something can happen where exchanging sexual content for maybe rent or something like that. That can be something that is happening. And then also a hostile environment where there is a lot of different sexual emotions and everything that's going on. That can really affect someone when it comes to housing. But really going back to the root of it is being discriminatory based off of male and female. That's something that could be discriminatory against.
Thank you. We're running short of time, and we're going to be talking about this a lot more in the future.
Sure.
I guess what I'd like to do before I get to my final question, Natalie, is can you describe a little bit about how the Fair Housing Act is making a difference here in Delaware?
Yeah, Don, if I could circle back and just kind of build briefly on Dominique's sharing of the Fair Housing Act. It's in addition to the rental or sale of a property, it's against the law to discriminate against someone because they are a member of a protected class in any real estate related transaction, in any housing related transaction. So whether it's buying, selling, insuring, appraising, refinancing. We saw the video about the people refinancing, and the appraiser discriminated against the family because she was a Black woman. So any housing related transaction, it doesn't have to just be renting and selling. It is anything related to procuring housing. It is against the law to discriminate against people because they are a member of a protected class. So I just want to make it clear to our audience that it's broader than renting and selling. It is listing it, appraising it, financing it. And we know there's a lot of racism in all of those arenas as it relates to housing. So providing services, facilities, HOAs are considered housing providers. And so we have a lot of cases against them. So, there's a very broad umbrella that covers what the fair housing law protects. And so I just want to make sure that your audience understands it's, a big umbrella. Also, under that umbrella, Delaware has 6 additional protected classes. So Delaware has expanded those protections, and our protected classes include marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity or gender expression, source of income, except for Section 8. And I am having and creed. And creed is a belief in a belief system that is separate from religion. So our website has a lot of information on that, but I want to be clear that raw protections beyond renting and buying and additional protections for individual protected classes.
I want to let the audience know that we will be sending out to them a lot of information about the Fair Housing Act for you to spend some more time studying. My last question before we get to the audience questions is really to both of you. And that is the question of, given the situation that we've been talking about for the last hour or so, what do you see the role of either the Alliance for Racial Justice as an organization or us as individuals? What can we do to help to dismantle this type of racism here in Delaware? Dominique, you want to start?
Okay. I think the best way to go about it is for you to kind of share the knowledge that you've heard in these different situations. Every time I do a presentation, I always say that sometimes it might not affect the people that I'm standing in front of, but you never know if it's affecting any other people that's around them. So in order for them to kind of help, please spread the knowledge. And if you feel very passionate about this, there's always council meetings that you can kind of go to. You can always talk to your local legislators. You can always push for some of these different things. Affordable housing is very, very, very important, and it's much needed. So if you can be on any type of communities, any type of committees that is kind of pushing this, in order to move the needle, we need more people. We need a whole army of people that's pushing behind us. That is really going to help this. So more voices, the better. So I just say use your voice in the right direction and kind of get connected with the right people and kind of spread what you know.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Natalie.
I think forums like this that provide an opportunity for people to learn are phenomenal. So to the extent that, you continue these kinds of forums and educational opportunities, like Dominique said, you spread the word. And so it's like a ripple effect. And I often say in the trainings that I do, knowing what I know about fair housing law has allowed me to help people. And so take what I learn and share that with other people for their benefit or for their knowledge. And then I think, to the extent that the Alliance members continue to educate themselves, there really is a lot of information out there. The Segregated by Design book will be a great one to start with. Look at the video on Bill and Daisy Myers and what they went through trying to move into Levittown in 1957. The thing that's meaningful to me is that this is recent history. A lot of this is within our lifetimes. And so continue to learn as much as you can. For you guys as an agency to continue to host these kinds of informational opportunities. And I think the takeaway is for folks to understand how integral housing is to everything in this country. The riots in Ferguson or the uprisings in Ferguson were a consequence of segregation and over-policing in that community. That was not random. The uprising in Baltimore when Freddie Gray was killed or arrested and then subsequently killed, those uprisings were a consequence of decisions to segregate that city in 1909 and then not to run the railway lines, the commuter rail out to the communities so folks could get to areas where there were jobs. And so to connect how these decisions are still happening. The Diamond State Community Land Trust decision in Sussex County blocked the development and construction of affordable housing. And so, as you're moving into these new communities, what's the collateral consequence of the people who are living there who aren't getting lifted up by this rising tide? And
Right.
so say, I want my community to have some areas for affordable housing. We sometimes have a lot of NIMBYism, and I'm a homeowner, so I want my property values to go up, but I also want a healthy community. And so give a little bit to get a whole lot for all of us. And that
Thank you. That's really good advice for us. I told you all that this time was going to go by very fast, and it did. Thank you so much. My part of this program is over. I see Charlotte's there. We're going to turn to the questions from the audience, but I see Charlotte's there with her hand out, and she gets precedence.
Just want to make one point, and it seems like the perfect time. And by the way, you've been fabulous, all three of you. But this was part one of housing and racism. We are having a part two on December the 8th to continue this conversation. So I thought this was a good time to announce it. I hope our audience will jot it down on their calendar. And Calvin, of course, will send out a reminder as we get closer to December the 8th. So anyway, let me turn it over to Calvin and the audience, who's been anxiously writing questions.
All right, well, first of all, thank you to the panelists. I mean, this was really fascinating. I learned a lot. So again, I'd like to thank both of you. So we have a few questions from the audience. I think some of you may have answered already, but there's still quite a few. So the first question, I have theorized that the GI Bill of Rights did more to segregate the nation than any other piece of legislation by encouraging whites to leave cities. Can either of you comment on that theory?
I know the GI Bill was a funding source. I'm not intricately familiar enough with it, but certainly, the funding, the monies that were available to soldiers returning over from war, was integral in also some of that government decision to build the suburbs to allay the housing shortages that existed in the cities. And so to the extent that the GI Bill was foundational in that funding, then yes, but I don't want to say yes because I don't know enough about it.
Dominic, you want to comment?
Yeah, I don't think I have a background on it as well. So I don't want to give false information.
I mean, right. Like GI, federal VA housing, the VA housing where you can get VA mortgages. Now if those are attached to that, and then so kind of that whole ripple effect of you can borrow money, but you can't live here. Well, then you can only borrow money to live here, and so the way it's applied can be as discriminatory as any other tool that's used to harm people. You can borrow, but you can only buy over here because this is for somebody else, and so its application could have been as discriminatory, depending on some of those decisions about who could get money and where they could buy.
Well, second question. How do you think the consolidation of all schools into larger districts and then busing students out of their neighborhood into other neighborhoods, do you think that was a positive or negative decision? I know a lot of these questions you may not be able to answer, but.
Dominique, do you want to jump in? Because I have a thought.
I have multiple thoughts, I think. So if I'm trying to figure out a way, because we work with Cape and Lopin High School, Seaford High School, Milford High School, and Sussex Tech High School. So most of those Cape, Tech, and Seaford, Cape, Milford, and Seaford, most of those kids are getting bused from their school, from their neighborhoods into the school. Sussex Tech is one of the situations that you're referring to, where they don't really have district lines, and they can kind of come from all over. The kids can kind of come from all over. And I think in order to answer the question, in my opinion, I think that's a broader opportunity for kids to kind of, because they're specialized in certifications and trades. And I think it gives students more of an opportunity to go to something that they might be interested in. And it kind of gives them an array of different things that they can kind of choose from. So if I can answer that in regards to the situation that Pathways to Success works with students, I think that is a good opportunity to allow students to do that. On the flip side, a lot of times it changed, especially when DuPont pulled out of Seaford. A lot of students started going to other schools like Sussex Tech. A lot of students, Seaford kids did not stay in their areas. So there is a positive and a negative situation to that when it comes to schools, in my opinion.
So I don't know if your members are aware of this recent settlement with the State of Delaware Department of Education on the funding, the inequities in funding for high needs students and how the state allocates funds. We have 19 districts in this state, which is mind-boggling to me. But anyway, this is a recent settlement where the Governor Carney has agreed to remediate some. I won't get into but I know J Street was very instrumental in it, and AACP. Delawareans for Educational Opportunity sued the state, alleging that there was disparities in funding for high needs students. Well, high needs students tend to come from low service communities, poor, underserved, segregated communities, and so that's one approach, I think. But I grew up here in Wilmington, and when I grew up here, there was a Wilmington school district, but because Wilmington is segregated, the schools were segregated, and so Brown v. Board of Education, was not being lived up to because the city was segregated, therefore the schools were segregated, and as the industry left and the communities. My mom was an educator in the Wilmington school district, and so kids got to go to neighborhood schools, but as the neighborhoods declined, the schools declined. And so then you split up the city, in district into these other districts and bust the kids out. Well, then, you've got one child over here and they're neighbors, but they're going to different schools. And so then the parents can't get to those schools. And so, I have personal feelings about it that splitting up districts or merging districts and busing kids is not a solution. It's a Band-Aid, but it doesn't really get to the underlying issue of segregated communities and segregated schools and segregation and the cycle of segregation impacts, which is economic, educational outcomes, health. And so it's not really stopping that cycle in a way that allows for communities to be healthy and diverse no matter where they are. So it's an approach, but I have an issue with taking kids out of their own neighborhood. Girls standing on street corners here at 5:45 being accosted because they're waiting for a bus to pick them up to take them to school across town, and they're being sexually harassed or worse because an adult has to be there with them to keep them safe. That's not healthy. That's not healthy. Going to a school and then getting on a bus and heading back out of town, it's not healthy. But staying in a segregated school is not healthy either. And so I think, addressing segregation at its core and creating healthy, vibrant, inclusive communities, no matter where they're geographically located, is the longer term, healthier solution.
And I think a lot of the communities, for example, Slaughter Neck is a community that separated the two districts by one road. Half of the road Half of the houses on one side of the road is Milford, half of the house is Cape and Open District. So I think that also affects them, the social effect that it has on students of people that you grew up with, where you're not able to kind of go to the same school with them. And also, I think there are big effects of some of the schools that are Title I that allows the free and reduced lunches, but all schools are not. So that's kind of a separation amongst the kids, that you might be getting a free lunch, but then someone else might not be. And how does a school kind of deal with that? You don't want someone to feel some kind of anxiety or depression because they are kind of getting lunch and someone else is not getting lunch. So I think there's a lot of that might be another town hall. There's a lot of information that can kind of come out of schools and district and the different lines. Absolutely.
And then you have the back to school nights or PTA meetings or teacher conferences. And you know, my kid is being bused to this school that's 15 miles away from where we live and 30 miles away from where I work. I'm an involved parent, but my kids are way over here and I don't get off work until this time. And then it's like, I lived in Florida. I taught in Florida. I taught in a Title I school in Florida, and I taught in a blue ribbon school in Florida. And so having that personal experience, having children in schools and teaching in those schools, the busing, it creates parental involvement, the opportunity for parents to be involved in their children's education or to come to their sports events, because the kids are, if you're transportation challenged anyway, and now my kid's in this school, that's 15 minutes away, 15 miles out of our neighborhood. And so those are some of the collateral consequences, that parents can't be involved as they might want to be because of things like merged districts and then busing. So it is not I don't see it as a good long-term solution. I think addressing and eliminating segregated communities is how we get to a much healthier country overall.
Yeah, and we know that parental involvement is crucial to education,
academic success. Yeah.
Kids need to see their parents at these events.
Yeah,
parents need to be involved.
Yeah.
Another question that came in: do builders or developers have any incentive to construct affordable housing in Sussex County? We talk about this all the time, that people cannot afford to live in Sussex County. And when builders do try to build affordable housing, they're often met with resistance. So is there any incentive?
That's the fight. That's the fight. That's the inclusionary zoning that I kind of spoke about early on. That's the incentive. That exactly what you're saying is what we are trying to push more towards more builders and contractors to do, because that it's a huge problem, because it's kind of based off of the market that some of the affordable houses is kind of around. So that is the fight that we're really trying to push towards to. I think there was something where I think Mr. Preston Shell, he was starting to build a community, and I'm not sure if he finished building that community where there was an incentive that was kind of tied in. I'm not sure where the process of that community is, but we're really trying to push, especially I'm a part of the Sussex Housing Group. That is one thing that we're really trying to push to really make it more incentive for that to happen, because in order to keep people here in Sussex County and to keep the businesses thriving, it's kind of a circle effect. We really have to make sure that people are able to kind of get around and kind of work at a place and then be able to get back home and be able to be in a safe and decent environment. So yes.
And to the extent that, the policymakers, those who make the decisions, the council who's making those zoning decisions, and then the permitting authorities, who's giving the builders the permits, who's letting them run the water lines, if they're not mandated, if that's not part of that, package, the financing, the support, the ability to take these lands and develop them, the developers aren't going to do what doesn't make them money, you know, so you have to kind of dangle that carrot and say, okay, you want to build these houses, you know, your decision makers in government should say, you know, you want to build it in our county, you got to do a set aside, you know, you got to build some houses that are affordable. Well, it's, you know, then they're kind of like, you know, then everybody else gets drawn, just, you know, and it's, so the way we value housing, the way we finance schools, you know, is driven by housing values. And so, you know, as a home, you know, people aren't going to want to buy a $400,000 house if there's a $200,000 house around the corner. Well, yes, they will if you do it right. You know, I think some creative kind of, you know, inclusionary zoning, but then some creative mandating around, you know, build more housing that other people can live in, and everybody gets lifted by that rising tide.
There's a big need of that, obviously, on the western side of Sussex.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, I think we could be here all night, but I'm looking up with two final questions. But we will have another town hall related to housing. So, but two final questions. I understand that as late as 2018, Delaware still had laws on the books allowing racial discrimination covenants on housing deeds. Is this correct?
They did not allow them, they existed. They were not enforced. The covenants, my understanding was these covenants had not been stricken. They were not enforced. And so you could transfer title to a property, and on that deed could be racially restrictive language. Now there was legislation passed really, really recently, I think 18 or 19 maybe, the years run together anymore, that simplifies the process for removing that language from your deed. So if you are a homeowner or property owner and you have a property that has this racially restrictive covenant or deed, while they were not enforced and they are discriminatory in on their face, they need to be gone. They're a legacy, and there is a mechanism. I have it somewhere in this. Oh, here we go. How to erase the unlawful racist language, and I can send this information on how to passage of Senate Bill 243. Simplify the process by which property owners and civic associations with deeds or related governing documents that contain racist language can remove those unlawful provisions. It is estimated there are 1,000 in Delaware CICs, community something covenants, that might be covered. Homeowners who wish to remove this type of language can remove them. So they did exist, they were not enforced, but they are a legacy of that history that we have in this state.
But people can have them removed.
You can have them removed, absolutely. And they've simplified the process for doing it.
So just one final question. Wasn't there an effort to get schools in Delaware to report per capita spending by students for each school, rather than allowing the district to report per capita spending for the district as a whole, thus allowing some schools to be underfunded? I'm not sure, that may be outside of what we want to discuss, but
an initiative to have schools report per student spending versus
an effort to get schools in Delaware to report per capita spending by students for each school, rather than allowing the district to report per capita spending for the district as a whole. So then you have some schools that are underfunded.
Yeah, I can't speak to that.
I can't.
Yeah, I can't speak to that. I don't doubt it, but I can't speak to it with any knowledge. There's a lot going on in the schools, but schools funding is a function of what the state allocates and then the tax base. So we know poor communities don't have the tax base to support to schools, and then the school allocates funding across different domains in different ways that are not equitable to meet the needs of the students. So, but any more than that, can't speak to.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you both again for being here and enlightening us on what's going on as far as housing. So I think with that, Charlotte, I see Charlotte has rejoined us.
I just wanted again to thank you. I thought it was a wonderful discussion with lots of knowledge. As Don would say, I learned a lot. So I want to thank the two of you. I want to thank Don. Don, wherever you are, you did a great job in moderating. So thank you. I hope you'll join us as we continue part 2. Calvin, as you know, we are always grateful for your production. And I thank the audience for remaining with us during this very stimulating discussion on a very, very important subject, because I think, as both speakers have said, the problem is still with us. Just by the mere fact that we can't get affordable workforce housing or anything that doesn't bear the name of something special and elite. So thank you very much. I truly appreciate it. I saw Ramona Fullman's name. So I want to thank Ramona Fullman. If she was there, Ramona is the Executive Director of the Commission on Human Relations. And I know someplace Faye Blake is here.
Yeah, Miss Faye is on, but she's under my name.
Okay.
So if you see,
wherever the two of you are, thank you very much for participating in this workshop by encouraging and letting us approach your staff and being a part of this. So thank you both.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Share this and the impact on our state.
Yes, and I think our message gets spread. I think you're right. 60 people heard you, and I'm hoping that 60 people will discuss it with 60 more people.
There you go.
We can keep it going.
That's
Great.
how we get.
Thank you.
So we get.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.